Greetings everyone, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video, we're going to have a build of the 1/72nd scale P-47D Thunderbolt Razorback from Academy that's part of the 70th anniversary of D-Day. So I'll be splitting this into three parts. In this video we'll do the building, in the second part the painting, and in the third part I'll do some stuff on weathering and also give my final review and thoughts on the kit after having built it. In a future video I'll also do the Focke-Wulf 190, although I'm doing it in a different scheme to the one that's included in this kit. So without further ado, let's get into it. After giving the P-47's parts a wash in some warm soapy water, I began to cut out the parts for the cockpit and also the two fuselage halves using a pair of side cutters, and then I started to glue the cockpit parts together. I glued the seat, joystick and rear bulkhead into place for the cockpit, before then painting the interior sidewalls, part of the rudder pedals and the cockpit floor itself 2 coats of Tamiya XF71 cockpit green. I made sure to thin the paint down a fair bit with the water so that the coats of paint would be nice and thin to help show all of the nice details underneath and also prevent any visible brush strokes. Each layer took around about 15 minutes to dry, so while waiting for the first layer to dry I began to cut out and assemble the engine. The P-47 was powered by the 2000 horsepower 18-cylinder R2800 double Wasp, which in this kit consists of 2 parts, one with the first row of 9 cylinders and the nose casing, and a second part containing the other 9 cylinders. There's then a pinion which kind of drops into the rear of the engine, which we'll deal with a little bit later. I then apply a second coat of XF71 to the cockpit, and while it's drying turn my attention back again to the engine, this time cutting out some bits of metal wire and shaping it with a set of tweezers, before gluing it into various parts of the engine to add a little bit of wiring details. Although my wiring may not be 100% accurate since I'm not really an engineer, I think it definitely adds an improvement, and there are a lot of wires and cables visible in the engine, especially leading to the cylinders. You could, if you wanted to, go overboard and 3D print an engine to replace the one in this kit, but honestly, even despite the age of the kit, it is still a very nicely detailed engine out of the box, and I decided I didn't really want to make any massive improvements to this kit and just enjoy building it as it is. Moving on, I started to paint the finer details in the cockpit using a bit of Vallejo flat black and a fine brush to start painting some of the instrument panels and the dials. The cockpit detailing for this kit is really quite fantastic despite the age of this kit, even if it is maybe in some areas a tiny bit simplified. One shortcoming, however, is there's no decal for the instrument panel for the cockpit, so to overcome this I painted the raised dials X1 gloss black and then dry brushed a little bit of Vallejo flat white, dabbing it onto the raised details on the instrument panels, and then I repeated this technique on some of the sidewall gauges and details as well. I use a fine brush to paint some XF16 flat aluminium onto the rudder pedals and the engine, and then I use the same brush to dry brush the interior to create some metal chipping. To do this, I wipe away the excess paint off the brush, and then start to dab or wipe it along the raised details for both the cockpit floor and the seat. This creates the effects of metal chips on the exposed areas, which are likely to receive a little bit of weathering as pilots use the aircraft over time. I then dry brushed or painted some additional details into the cockpit based on reference photos, using various colours including Vallejo's Vermilion Red, Flat Yellow and Deep Green, and Tamiya's XF52 Flat Earth. I used some flat black to paint the anti-slip area for the pilot's feet after I'd done the metal chipping, and then I used some 1mm masking tape to create some seat belts, cutting them out with a pair of scissors and then tweezering or cocktail stick pushing them into place. I then paint them XF52 Flat Earth to give them a bit more of a dull down appearance, and while the seatbelts dry I get out some Vallejo gloss varnish and use a very fine brush to dab a tiny bit onto the various dials around the cockpit to create the effect of glass. It's a very subtle effect, especially at this scale, but I wanted to experiment a little bit with it. I paint the nose casing for the engine XF24 dark grey, the wiring and cables I've added X31 titanium gold, and then a little bit of flat black on some of the extra engine details. While the details on the engine dry, I glue the instrument panel into the cockpit floor, and after test fitting it with the fuselage, get out a bit of Tamiya panel liner scent black, and apply a good coat over both the engine and also all of the interior of the cockpit. The panel liner helps bring out all of the nice details, and also adds a little bit of a weathered, kind of dirty effect. I give the panel liner a good 10 to 15 minutes to dry, and in the meantime cut out the engine cowling and glue into place one of the air intake covers that's on the inside. I then glue the fuselage floor to one of the cockpit halves once the panel line is dried, and then after running a bead of glue around the outside of one of the fuselage halves, I then stick them together and use a couple of bulldogs and a bit of masking tape to hold the fuselage halves together while the glue dries. I stuck the propeller shaft into the engine and used a bulldog clip to keep it from falling backwards. This will be a later issue that I'll talk about, and glued it to the fuselage halves to help lock them in place while they dried. I then cut out the landing gear struts and the main door flaps for them and glued them together, and then cut out all 4 halves of the wings and glued them together as well, using a bit of masking tape to also hold them together while they dried. Overall, the fit of the wings and the landing gear struts was pretty good, and there wasn't really any gaps. Once I was satisfied the fuselage halves had had enough time to dry, I removed the excess masking tape and then glued the 2 wing halves to the fuselage. Despite appearances, the wings and the fuselage halves fit together really excellently with very little gap, and the joint is really nice and solid, so the wings don't tend to fall out of place while they're drying. I glued the elevators to the rear of the aircraft, and once they were in position, I then painted the engine cowling. I decided to experiment with Vallejo 70954 yellow-green as a zinc chromac colour by doing one coat on the engine cowling and the bulkhead and seeing how it turned out. While waiting for the yellow-green to dry, I removed the excess masking tape from the wings and glued the tail wheel and other landing gear parts, including the landing gear bay doors, into place. I left attaching the wheels until after the struts had been attached to the aircraft so that I could sand down one part of the wheel to make the base a little bit flat so the aircraft looks like it was putting a bit of weight onto its tyres. I glue the wheels into place after I've sanded them and make sure they line up, and then glued a few more accessories onto the aircraft. As I've mentioned, there is a bit of a problem with the propeller shaft, which is that it does not sit flush with the bulkhead, so if you try to push the propeller onto the shaft to glue it into place, it will end up pushing the shaft backwards and you can't actually attach them. Unfortunately, you can't attach the propeller to the shaft before gluing the engine to the bulkhead, because then you can't fit the engine cowling around either the propeller or the engine. You could probably just glue the propeller to the engine casing after you've installed the engine cowling and not have it spin, but I decided instead to address it after I'd painted the aircraft so it could still spin. In the meantime, I used a file to sand down the seam line between the fuselage and the wing halves, and used a bit of Vallejo water-based putty to fill in any of the gaps, and after letting the putty dry for a bit, I then sanded down the aircraft again with some much finer sandpaper. I used a Tamiya scribing tool to rescore some of the panel lines I'd accidentally sanded out in the process, and with that the aircraft was ready for painting, which is what we'll be covering in the next video. But, as always, thank you very much for having a watch of this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you have any questions or even some constructive criticism, please feel free to leave it down in the comments section below. A big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits and the various products I use, and also for helping out with my animations. And I'd also like to give a big shout out to Tectonic Hobbies, the local hobby shop on the Sunshine Coast, where you can buy this kit and many of the products that I've used in this video. Since I work there, I do get a slight discount, and some of you eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed that the layout of the shop is a bit different since we've been going through some renovations. So there's a lot more space now in the shop, and hopefully we will be doing a nice large order of some more model kits in the coming months. So stay tuned for that. Thank you again to everyone for watching my videos. I've finally been able to monetize my YouTube channel, which has been a really big goal for me this year, so thanks a lot, and until the next video, model on!